Thank you so much, Diana. Can you all hear me? Okay, excellent. And I want to first start off by thanking the organizers, Leanne and Jonathan and Christine, so much for inviting me. Looks like an incredible lineup of speakers, and I'm really excited to participate. So my research is all about how group membership and prejudice change the course of social cognition. So I study how processes like empathy and communication break down when the social context shifts from me and you to us and them. And I'm equally interested in the behavioral consequences of these shifts. So one thing I've studied quite a bit over the last few years is the intergroup empathy bias, whereby people experience greater empathy for in-group members relative to out-group members. So how do you feel when you witness or learn of another person's misfortune? Of course, a common response is that you empathize with them. You feel bad for them or feel some version of what they're feeling, and this is an important response because we know that it potentiates or increases the probability of altruistic or helping behavior. But of course, it's not the case that you empathize with all people all the time, nor would it make sense if you did. So an alternative, of course, is that you feel nothing. And it turns out that more and more evidence indicates that these lapses in empathy are most likely when the targets of empathy are socially distant, so when they belong to different social or cultural groups. That said, the absence of empathy is not antipathy, really. It's more something like apathy, right? And apathy is not a thing that we usually consider as a co-motivator of behavior. So much more than the absence of empathy, what I'm interested in is when people feel the exact opposite of what the target is feeling. Something I call counter-empathic responses. For example, pleasure in response to others' misfortunes, what the Germans call Schadenfreude, or another German word, which is Glücksschmerz, which refers to feeling bad about other people's good fortunes. Now, the reason I'm interested in these counter-empathic responses is that I think, in contrast to apathy, I do think that these could be significant motivators of aggressive and hostile behavior in intergroup contexts. So what predicts which of these three responses we have in any given scenario? Well, I'm going to argue that our perceptions of their competitiveness with us guide our responses in large part. That is, groups that are seen as competitive with our own interests, but also capable of enacting that competitive threat are going to be the ones that are most likely to be targeted with dampened empathy and counter-empathic responses. So the first place we sought to examine this was in an explicitly competitive context, where people would be willing to report these kinds of emotions. So, do I have any Red Sox fans in the room? Yes, I know I can always count on you to know. Okay, so I'm going to have you watch this baseball play where the Yankees are batting and the Orioles are pitching. And so what you see here is the ball gets pitched, the Yankee batter hits it, and he gets tagged out at first. Jamil, how do you feel? Lori's clapping? Yeah, exactly. You feel good, right? And we know that this positive response is due to the long-standing rivalry between these two groups, despite the fact that there's no immediate material benefit to your own team. They're not even playing in the game. And this stimulus only takes on a positive value by virtue of the fact that you identify as a Red Sox fan, right? If you didn't care about baseball at all, this wouldn't mean anything to you. And so one of the things we were interested in was investigating whether this kind of value would rely on circuits that are generally neural circuits that generally track non-social forms of value. So we scanned 18 hardcore Red Sox and Yankees fans, and what we found was that watching plays where their own team did well, or that their rival did poorly, including plays where their rival did poorly against the Orioles, engaged a variety of regions, but the only one that was correlated with self-reported pleasure was the ventral putamen and a little bit of the nucleus accumbens. So we know that this broader structure, as I'm sure many of you know, that this ventral striatum is implicated in the process of tagging unexpected events in the service of shaping future behavior, right? It's implicated in reward and learning and motivation. So one thing we were interested in, given the ventral striatum's purported role in reinforcement learning, was whether or not this signal was related to an increased desire to do harm to the rival and affiliated individuals. Let me unpack that a little bit. The idea is that if every time you see a misfortune befall your rival, it's accompanied by the experience of pleasure, does that pleasure then reinforce the working of harm against that rival and its group members? So to test this idea in a very preliminary manner, what we did is we sent all of our participants a follow-up web survey 2 weeks after we scanned them, where we asked them how likely they would be to enact a variety of aggressive behaviors, both towards rivals and towards Orioles fans. And not surprisingly, Red Sox and Yankees fans said that they would be more likely to heckle, insult, threaten, and hit rival fans compared to Orioles fans. But what was more interesting was that those people who said that they would engage that much more in rival-specific aggression were also those people who exhibited that much more ventral putamen activation when watching their rivals fail in the scanner 2 weeks prior. Now, of course, huge grain of salt, small sample, small effect. It is worth noting that Britt Hine has a beautiful 2010 Neuron paper where she finds a very similar result except with soccer fans. And what she finds there is that those soccer fans who exhibit that much more ventral striatal activation when watching rival fans receive an electric shock are that much less likely to help alleviate the pain of those rival fans in future interactions. But what we find is that the effect of competition on empathy emerges in much more subtle contexts. So how would you feel if you saw this gentleman accidentally walk into the glass door? A little sad, right? Or is he okay? Not a little concerned, right? What about this guy? I love this experiment. It always works. Okay? So there's no explicit competition between you and either of the targets pictured here, but it turns out that the stereotypes associated with the guy on the right include attributions of competitiveness. And that's enough to modulate people's empathic responses. So what I find is that people actually smile more, as measured by facial electromyography from the zygomaticus major, that's the cheek muscles that hold your face into a smile. People smile more when negative events befall the guy on the right relative to many other targets, including the guy on the left. And what we find is that people are also more willing to submit the guy on the right and people like him to electric shocks, so they're also more willing to harm them. And one of the things that's important to note is that this is true across a wide variety of exemplars and seems to be best explained by the competitiveness and the status of the targets as opposed to any other dimensions along which they differ, so for example, their age. Now, one of the things that's particularly interesting about humans is how quickly they form groups and how quickly those groups inform their attitudes, thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Like this guy here, right? You don't need much to generate tension between groups, and we've known for decades now from classic social psychological research that even if everybody knows each other going into a room, randomly assigning them to teams already engenders bias in terms of how people allocate resources. So one of the things we were interested in was examining whether or not this effect of competition on empathy emerged even among novel groups with no stereotypes, no history of rivalry, and just been assigned. So we had you complete 5 personality items, and then we randomly assign you to 1 or 2 teams, though we tell you it was based on your personality profile. So you were all assigned to the Eagles, the other team was the Rattlers. This is in homage to Sharif and the famous Robert P. Sims. So what I tell you is that these 2 teams have actually been participating in a series of problem-solving challenges. And so your team so far has 82 points, and the other team has 84 points. So only one team can win the bonus. Whichever team gets to 100 points first is going to win that bonus. This is setting up a competitive contest. But we're also making sure that the team is a competitive threat, right? They're 2 points ahead of your team. So they are capable rivals. We also had an independent condition where we said, whatever team gets to 100 points, everybody will get the bonus on that team. So this is not a competition. Each team can win the bonus independently. And of course, we also had a cooperative condition where we said, you should work together to get to 200 points. And whenever the teams together get 200 points, everybody gets a bonus. Now we tell them in order to, scientific evidence suggests that the more you know about the other players in the game, the better you will do on these problem-solving challenges. And so in order to give you an opportunity to get to know some of these other players, we're going to show you events that they said happened to them. And we're just going to ask you to tell us how it made you feel so we know you're actually reading them. So you would see something like this. Brian is out, remember, because you guys are all Eagles. Brian got soaked by a taxi driver to the puddle. And then we ask you, how bad does this make you feel and how good does this make you feel? Very simple. And the reason we ask you on 2 different scales is because the prediction is that what you're feeling is potentially an ambivalence, right? A mix of different kinds of emotions. So maybe you feel a little bit bad, but you also feel a little bit good. And if we had used a bipolar scale, we would just average out and look neutral, which is not actually capturing people's emotional profiles. So here's the first data point. This is the sort of canonical empathy scenario. How bad do you feel about a negative event? The red line is the competitive position, the gray line is independent, and the blue is cooperative. And the thing that should jump out at you is that you see the biggest difference between how much empathy people feel for the in-group and out-group when teams are competitive, right? That difference is attenuated when teams are independent and completely eliminated when teams are cooperative with one another. Now this is true also for positive empathy, so how good do you feel about positive events? And then in the first counter-empathic, this is how bad do you feel about positive events? This is Bookshare. Well, we see that we're actually getting the effect also for counter-empathic responses, but only in the competitive condition. And finally, and arguably the most pernicious quadrant of this graph, what we find is that people do express significantly more Schadenfreude in response to competitive outgroups relative to the other conditions. So we ran several follow-up experiments. The first thing I want to share with you is that people don't exhibit any intergroup bias in how bad or good they think the target feels. So I'm perfectly capable and happy to say that Brian feels like crap when he gets stoked by a taxi. It's just that I don't feel bad about it. We're not as bad as when Brian is a teammate. We also replicate the results with extreme good and bad fortune. So instead of maybe having a stomach ache, we say contracted H1N1. Everything replicates perfectly. And it's also the case that in sort of opportunities to give us feedback and these open-ended questions at the end of the experiments, people report very enthusiastic identifications with their team. Like this intergroup, who's my favorite intergroup of all time. They took these team assignments very seriously, even though they had just been assigned. And as a side note, this other anecdote I have about this team assignment situation, you know, we've done versions where we assign people online and then we bring them back into the lab. And the first question we ask them is, do you remember which team you're on? And one woman said to me one time, well, of course I remember which team I'm on. Like, randomly assigned. Okay, explain to me why, of course. She said, well, I'm on the Eagles, and my family is a military family. So the Eagles are very important totem for us. And it was just this amazing snapshot of how people make sense of these kinds of group assignments and imbue them with meaning, and how that meaning then impacts all sorts of interesting consequences processes. Now, of course, one of the things we're interested in is attenuating this kind of a bias, both in empathic and counterempathic emotions. And we showed you that in the previous experiment, if you made teams cooperative, you could eliminate it. But of course, you can't always make teams cooperative in the real world. So are there other ways to approach this? So what we sought to do in this experiment was to change people's representations about how these groups relate to one another. That is, sort of blur the boundaries between the teams. So right after we assigned them to a team, we showed people, for no reason that we explained to them, a player network. This is what I'll call the segregated condition, and presumably something like people's default representations when I tell you, oh, everybody was assigned to one team because they weren't like one another, this other team is like each other, and they're not like one another, the two teams are distinct from one another. Now the other half of participants were randomly assigned to see this network, right, which is what I'll call the integrated network. And again, we didn't explain how it was that these networks were generated. We just said they were based on people's personality profile responses. And the only other change that we made was, instead of putting the logo in all of the ratings, we put the network and then circled the individual to whom the event had happened, right? So I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little gold ring, and that's supposed to be more of who lost $5. So what we find is that when you expose people to the integrated version of the network, you actually can attenuate this bias, presumably because what we're doing is disrupting their representations of how sort of distinct and antagonistic these groups are. This is true also for positive empathy. The slope of the line is not eliminated, but it is attenuated. And this is not true for Glitchmerks. There's one weird quadrant, and I don't have a good explanation for this, where actually people express greater Glitchmerks when they've seen the integrated network than the segregated network. But in what, again, I would argue is potentially the most important case, we see a flattening of the line in the Schadenfreude case. We've also done some work looking at whether or not framing the events in a sort of richer narrative can also help to decouple people's representations of the target as just a group member. So what if instead of saying just, Jane managed to get indoors before it started pouring rain, I give you this whole story about Jane, right? She's hoping to make more money, she's crossing the street, she looks up to see the clouds are threatening, and so on and so forth, right? Is it the case that this could be used to attenuate this sort of bias? So here when I'm showing you, the data are a little bit different. Each bar is just the distance between in-group and out-group. So this is the gap, basically. What we see is that when we give people only the event, that's what I'll call the sparse condition, you see a much greater gap than when it's enveloped in this greater narrative. And this is true across all of the different quadrants. Now you may be wondering, how on earth is this happening? Like, what is the mechanism by which you are somehow crowding out the encoding of the information of the group, if that's at all what's happening? So we thought that basically just that the narrative made the person less sort of stereotypically or prototypically a group member because you had all this other information about it. It effectively dilutes the sort of impact of the group membership information such that you would actually have poor memory for it because it's no longer the only diagnostic piece of information you have about the target. So we reran the study, and this time what we did was we gave everybody a surprise survey at the end. We said, we gave them all the stories that they'd seen. We said, Brian got soaked by a taxi. Which team is Brian on? And the prediction is if the narratives are somehow crowding out group membership and coding, then people should actually have poor memory for the team membership, even though in the narrative condition, they spend more time on the page by virtue of the fact that there were just more words to read, right? And their name was repeated more often and so on. And so this is exactly what we find. People who were in the sparse condition had better memory in a surprise memory task for the group membership, both as in-group and out-group members after the task, relative to when they saw those events developed in the narrative. But you may be wondering to yourself, well, you gave them all this other information, and so maybe what you're doing is crowding out memory for anything. So we ran the experiment yet again, and this time instead of asking them to recall which team each person is on, we'd say, Ryan is on the Eagles, which event happened to him? And lo and behold, those people who read the rich version of the environment of the narratives actually had better memory for the content of the event. So it seems to be the case that the narratives is specifically disrupting membership and group membership and coding. Now you may be saying to yourself, okay, groups, teams, competition, these contexts all license people to say horrible things, but we don't actually think that this is something that people would be willing to say when we're in the context of real social groups. Not so. So we reran this experiment with American participants who then read stories about American and Arab targets. And what we find is that not only do people report having greater empathy for Americans relative to Arabs, they also report greater counter-empathic responses for Arabs relative to Americans. And at the end, we also asked them to please complete as many puzzles as they felt like completing, and each puzzle would basically turn into 10 cents that we then donated to the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. What we find is that there's a weak relationship between how much empathy people report for the outgroup and how many puzzles they're willing to complete. But there's a slightly stronger relationship between the counter-empathic responses. So this is more tightly linked to how much people are willing to help the outgroup. Now, everything I've talked about today has been based on sort of one-shot intergroup interactions. But what I'm really interested in is sort of temporal dynamics of this kind of process. And the overarching idea goes something like this. The cycle of intergroup regression may begin with the passive observation of the suffering of another individual, right? So there's some harm and it befalls a target, but your emotional response to that target is going to depend on what your functional relations are with that target. So if it's an in-group member, maybe you feel empathy. If it's a neutral out-group member, maybe you feel apathy. But if it's a competitive out-group member, that may engender some pleasure. And now the question is whether or not this pleasure then potentiates a small aggressive behavior, or at least the absence of a healthy behavior. Now, in the sense, if you don't help, or if you do engage in a small aggressive behavior, that then leads to yet another negative outcome for this person. And assuming that person's identity hasn't changed, that feeds back into the cycle, and around we go. And another thing we're interested in understanding is whether or not the repeated small harms may escalate over time, and whether that then predicts increased identification with the group via perhaps cognitive dissonance mechanisms. Right? So if I keep hurting the out-group, is it the case that I have now understood that I am that much more committed to my in-group? And so we're interested in exploring this relationship as well. Now, we're running the studies right now to test all of these predictions, but you'll forgive me for taking advantage of this opportunity. I've just received word that I will have 3 years of postdoctoral funding for this project, so if any of you are interested, okay. So, as a field, we've accumulated vast amounts of evidence to indicate that we have a very strong and early emerging moral prohibitions against harm, right? That we have deep preferences for fair and equitable behavior. And I take no issue with those findings. People are good until they're not. And what I'm interested in is these boundary conditions, right? Understanding the specific dynamics that give rise to these kinds of progressive behaviors. So understanding the role of empathy and apathy in intergroup contexts is of course going to be extremely important. But what I hope I've convinced you of today is that, at least initially, it may be less critical to foster empathy and much more important to stave off negative emotions or antipathy that gives rise to things like pleasure and response to other people's misfortunes. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you, the organizers, my lab, my collaborators, funding sources, and I'm happy to take questions as we switch over laptops to the next presentation.